Okay, I'm going to give you a real quick introduction. I'm a farmer. How's that? I think the presentation kind of speaks for itself, so I'm not going to waste too much time on an introduction. We'll just get after this. Just so you guys know, so I'm from Center, Colorado. Anybody ever been there? Oh, I see one hand here. So a couple of things that are different about where we farm is we're high and we're dry. We're 7,600 feet above sea level. So pretty high elevation. I think you guys were roughly 4,500 here, so we're keep going up and you'll get to us. We're also very dry. I know you guys have been having a mild winter. We are very much in the same boat. Our annual precipitation is right around 6 inches. So we are technically a desert. So water conservation drives the majority of the decisions that we've made on our farm as far as what we're talking about today. So I'm third generation on the farm. My grandpa started the farm in 1938. My dad and uncle ran the farm after he did, and now me and my brother are running the farm. So here's just a real quick picture. So this was back in the 1950s. This was when my grandpa was running the operation. He was growing potatoes. He had some diverse forage crops out there for sheep. So he had livestock on the farm at the time too. And you can see in this picture my grandma's giant garden. She was a real avid gardener, did a lot of canning. So everybody was really well fed when they went to grandma's house. So when my grandpa was farming there, you know, he didn't have any water either. So he was irrigated. But how he irrigated is a little bit different because pay attention to the shapes of the fields here. They were square back then. So one major thing that has changed on this farm since then is the shapes of the fields. So in the 70s, center pivot irrigation came into the area. At the time, the reason it became so popular is they just told us that we were going to become a lot more efficient with our water, which was true, but we also became very efficient at depleting the aquifer from which those sprinklers were pulling from. We're now in a situation where we've depleted the aquifer from which we pump. We are making very major changes as a community trying to conserve water because we're getting into some pretty desperate times now. So the shape of the field has changed. We're center pivot now. You see we've got a couple more potato storages on the place now. When Grandpa was farming, he was doing about 40 acres of potatoes. Now we do 250 acres of potatoes. And we've got 500 acres total under irrigation. And then I'll go a little bit more what we're doing with all those acres here in just a second. So here's just an aerial shot if you ever happen to fly over the San Luis Valley. So here's all the center pivots, so a lot of circles there. The other thing to keep in mind here too is you see once you leave that circle, there's not a whole lot growing beyond irrigation. So without irrigation, there's no way anybody would be living in this place. There wouldn't be agriculture. Less than 6 inches, you're not going to grow a whole lot of food on that. So we do have a lot of limitations there as far as the water and trying to figure out, you know, how to maximize a lot of these soil health principles that you guys have been learning about this morning. We do grow potatoes, but the potato varieties we grow are also much different. We don't grow any russet varieties on our farm. We basically made a decision back in the 90s that we wanted to grow potatoes that taste good. So we got into the specialty varieties. We do a lot of different varieties as far as yellows, reds, pink skin. We've got some that are purple skin, white inside, purple skin, purple inside. And you'll notice there's a few fingerling varieties on here as well. We were actually the very first farm in the United States to bring fingerling potatoes into production. We brought the first test tubes in from Europe through Cornell University, had the first certified seed of those fingerling varieties, and the first warehouse to run them. So we do take a lot of credit there as far as bringing some of these new varieties in. But I like to emphasize that because it really just shows this was the mindset that I was taught early on, with just don't be afraid to try some different things. And so I'm just kind of continuing on with that now with some of our different practices that we're using. We grow potatoes for two different reasons. We grow them for certified seed and for fresh market both. So we do have our own tissue culture lab and our own greenhouse. So this is some plantlets being planted in the greenhouse. And the whole point behind this is that's where all certified seed starts from. We're growing mini tubers from disease-free plants, and those are being introduced into our cropping system every single year. And if you look real close, you'll see some other plants in there that aren't potatoes. I don't have a monoculture anywhere on my field, in my farm, and that includes the greenhouse crop. So we're going to go into a lot more detail on that one as well. So here's just an idea of some of the mini tubers that's coming out of the greenhouse for production. So those will get planted in my field this summer as part of our Generation 1 seed crop. We do emphasize education a lot on our farm. We give a lot of tours. We had a field day this summer, but this is one of my favorite projects. We've got an FFA program about 30 miles from us, and they were able to build a really nice greenhouse as a result of a grant. They didn't really have anything growing in there. So now I let these kids grow one potato greenhouse crop for me each year. So not only is it providing them with an educational opportunity, but at the end of the year, I buy these potatoes back from them, and it creates a really nice fundraiser. About 2 weeks ago, we just got done harvesting this year's crop. I brought another grower in with me, and they were able to grow us enough potatoes that they basically made about $5,000 off of this project. So a really good fundraiser for these kids, and just the education that comes along with it is really nice. So this is my grandpa. Like I said, he's the one that started the farm originally. And this is one thing that I heard over and over and over again growing up. But he really emphasized that you have to take care of the soil before the soil can take care of you. And those are the principles on which he was farming. And unfortunately, at some point, we kind of fell into a lot of the same traps that everybody did in agriculture, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. And so those are the kind of things I want to talk about. Before I talk about the practices we're using now, I want to talk a little bit more about kind of how we got away from those principles and why we had to bring them back in. And I think a big part of the reason why is we started looking at everything as a linear system. No matter how you're growing a potato crop, you're always going to have these problems surrounding you that you're going to have to deal with, whether it be pest, insects, a disease that grows on the plant or in the soil, fertility, all these issues. But the trouble is we thought we could solve all these problems in a direct fashion. If we had a problem, let's go ahead and try to remove that problem. And we weren't looking at how the system all fit together. So if you look at a lot of the solutions we were trying to use here, there's a real common theme here with a lot of these solutions. Do you guys see what it is? Side. Have you guys ever looked up side in the dictionary? Do you know what that word literally means? It means death. So here we were trying to grow a living crop to feed people, to sustain life, but we were trying to use death to solve our problems. And that's where we started running into these issues. So if we take this system and look at this, what we had to realize is just there were other factors here that really mess up that linear thought process. So we weren't taking things into consideration like the beneficial insects, the life on the plant, life in the soil, carbon and soil structure were things that we were neglecting. So we grow certified seed, so that means pest insects can be a threat to us. The number one pest insect that's threatening to us are aphid. Aphid spread virus throughout a potato crop, and a part of being a certified seed grower, I have to meet certain tolerances on these viruses. So if I don't do anything to manage these aphid, they will spread virus all through my potato crop, and I won't have a crop I can sell at the end of the year. So early on, we identified this aphid as a threat. So of course, we started coming in with an insecticide. We thought, well, let's remove that threat from the system. But the trouble is we just stopped there, and we didn't look at what other impacts we might have. So we were going out there with these broad spectrum pesticides and insecticides and killing off not only the pests, but all the beneficial insects. Now this is where the problems truly started. Because we had two different groups of insects here, right? We had insects that fed off of plants, and we had insects that fed off of the other insects. So when you come in with an insecticide and wipe both of them from the system, which one's going to come back first? Well, the one that's going to come back first is one that's going to feed off of the plants. So by choosing this as our solution, we actually created an opportunity for an even bigger problem to present itself. Because if you go in with an insecticide one time and wipe them both out, now the pest insect actually has an opportunity to come back in even larger force and cause more problems for us. So now the solution is not only are you having to use that insecticide one time, but now you're creating a bigger problem. So now you have to come in with the insecticide more often. You're putting on more applications. You're changing the chemistry because now you might be developing some resistance with those aphids. So you have to keep changing that up. And it kind of creates a slippery slope. Now we have to continue down that path. But the problems aren't just isolated to what we were doing to the beneficial insects on the plant, but we were also having a huge impact on a lot of other insects that we weren't taking into consideration. There was a lot of different insects on the soil surface and down in the soil that were being impacted by this approach as well. So we were killing a lot of life in the soil by using this, trying to attack that one problem. Now, a very similar problem was happening with our use of fungicides and soil fumigants. Now, we had a lot of disease that could be problematic that lives in the soil and on the plant, so we were trying to use different ways of killing off these problems. But the trouble is, a lot of these fungicides, if you were to take them into a lab and test them on those diseases, sure, they do a good job of killing off that disease. But when you're using a lot of these broad spectrums, we're also killing off a lot of the beneficial fungi that might be living on the plant or in the soil. And once we start doing that, a lot of that life on the plant and in the soil actually do a really good job of controlling those diseases for us. But once we take this approach and start trying to kill our problem, now we've all created a situation where we are actually more vulnerable to an epidemic and an outbreak and having huge economic losses by doing this. So now we have to put on more and more fungicides. We've got our 10-day applications. We're starting to change the chemistry on that because we're developing some resistance here as well. So I've got a good friend that refers to this as the moron theory, right? If some work, then you got to put more on. And so this was the approach we were taking, and we never seemed to get on top of our problems. And like I said, we were also removing a lot of the beneficial life in the soil that had the potential to control these problems for us. But now is where it got real interesting. Because when my grandpa was farming potatoes back in the 50s, he was never worried about parasitic nematodes. Now, in potato production, parasitic nematodes can be devastating if left unchecked, because they'll actually lay their eggs in the potatoes, and when they hatch, they create these bubbles, these blisters all over the potatoes, makes them unmarketable, and it'll destroy the crop for us. But what's really interesting about this is where parasitic nematodes first came into the valley and caused problems is where the heaviest amounts of fungicides and soil fumigants were being used. So why would that be? We're talking about two completely different things here, right? The nematodes are these little worm-like structures in the soil, and fumigants in the soil, and the fungicides are for controlling a completely different problem. But we weren't looking at this holistically. Sorry about that. Okay, so the things we weren't taking into consideration were these. So there are many different species of beneficial fungi that live in the soil that actually do a tremendous job of trapping and killing nematodes for us. And this is just one example. And here's a nice little video that shows one of these guys in action. But there's this one specific beneficial fungi in the soil that has these lassos on it. And it's pretty cool is when those nematodes swim through there, it triggers that lasso. It clamps down on that nematode. It'll hold on to it. It'll eventually kill that nematode, and then it'll feed on it, and some different bacteria will come on later on as well and use that nematode as part of its food source. But the trouble is when we were using the fungicides and the soil fumigants, we were removing these beneficial fungi from the soil along with some other beneficial fungi, and now we were the ones that created the opportunity for the nematodes to now come in and cause problems for us. So it was really, the first step we had to take was kind of realizing that the practices we were using were creating these other problems. So now we have a parasitic nematode problem. So you can see by looking at this slide, so what's our next approach going to be? More death, right? So now we have another living thing that we need to try to kill off. So now we start using nematicides, trying to kill off another problem. And the other big factor with this too is, do you think these nematicides are free? This had a huge economic impact on our production as well. We're coming in with all these other chemicals, all these different products that we have to purchase in order to grow the same potato crop to solve a problem that we created ourselves. But the trouble with these nematicides too is, we're so worried about the parasitic nematodes that are causing problems to the potatoes, but the parasitic nematodes are only a small portion of the total population of nematodes in the soil. The parasitic nematodes only make up about 10% of the total population of all the nematodes in the soil. The other 90% are actually very beneficial to this potato crop. A lot of them control other pests, and a lot of them have a lot to do with nutrient cycling in the soil. So here, if we're applying these nematicides, trying to take care of that one pest, we're damaging how the rest of the system functions as well, and now we're creating other potential problems by taking this approach. Now, fertility was one of the hardest ones for us to figure out about this, because no matter what, when we're growing a potato crop, if we're harvesting that crop and removing that crop from the system, we're exporting nutrients, right? So at some point, we're going to have to bring some nutrients back in. So we thought, well, obviously, we're not going to be able to get away from fertility. But the problem wasn't the fact that we were adding fertility, but it was the form that the fertility was in is where we were causing these problems. We were using synthetic forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, the trouble with these synthetic forms of fertilizer is they are very harsh on a couple of, two very good examples is nitrogen-fixing bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. And the list goes on and on. But there are bacteria that live in the soil that can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and add it to the soil for us. Now, mycorrhizal fungi can take phosphorus from the soil and make it available to the plant. But it turns out both of these absolutely hate living in the presence of synthetic fertilizers. So once we start adding synthetic fertilizers to the system, we shut down a couple of naturally occurring components that were adding fertility to the soil for us. So now we don't have them functioning properly, so now we have to put more synthetic fertilizers on to offset that. So once again, that comes with a price tag, and that has an impact on the economics as well. So here's a paper I really encourage everybody to read. It's by Dr. Christine Jones. If you guys go to amazingcarbon.com, everything I just talked about as far as the mycorrhiza and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, she does a really good job in here talking about how those synthetic fertilizers are so devastating to both of those. So I would really encourage you guys to go on and read that so you can expand your knowledge even beyond what we're talking about here today. So there's something else that comes along with these synthetic fertilizers, right? Not only are they harmful to the mycorrhiza, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but they also come with heavy amounts of salt. So just overall, it creates a very harmful environment in the soil. Because does anything like to live in a high amount of salt? You know, when we butcher a hog, first thing we do is we take that bacon and add a bunch of salt to it, right? Why are we doing that? So we can cure it and preserve it because nothing's going to live on there. So we're basically doing the same thing to these soils too when we're adding all these synthetic fertilizers. We're creating an environment where nothing wants to live there. So I think one thing that's really neat about putting this all together, and the reason I first started putting these slides together like this is when we first started making some transitions, I had to do this for myself just to kind of figure out how all these things fit together. But I thought it was kind of neat looking at what a central hub life in the soil became. You see how many times we have arrows coming in and out of that? That life in the soil is very important. But we had to expand our knowledge even beyond that because we really had to start thinking about carbon and soil structure as well. Because we grow potatoes, so the process of harvesting potatoes is a pretty massive soil disturbance. So we can be pretty harsh on our soil structure just from the physical disturbance. But the trouble is if we don't have any life in the soil, we don't have anything to put those soil aggregates back together. When you have soil particles in the soil, the bacteria and the fungi are the ones that actually glue them together and start building these aggregates to create the environment they like living in. And without carbon to feed that life in the soil, they don't have the ability to do their job, and the carbon itself adds to the soil structure. So these three have a very important relationship with each other. If you go in and damage one of those, you're going to hurt the other two as well. And that's what we were doing by using this system of farming. So now that we had very little life in the soil, we had poor soil structure, and we had very little carbon in the soil, this was having a huge impact on our water. Now, I mentioned before, water is a very scarce commodity in our area. It drives a lot of our decisions, but we were also being very wasteful with our water as well. And you become very inefficient with how you're utilizing this water when you don't have that soil structure and the life, and even the high salts from the fertilizer can have an impact on this as well. Now, the other thing that comes along with poor soil structure are problems like this. So not only are, we're affecting water infiltration rate and a lot of things as far as how the water interacts with the plant, but we were having physical problems out there as well. So growing up, we had one center pivot where we just knew that every single year it was going to get buried, just like this picture here. We just accepted it as fact, and what did we blame? We blamed the soil type. We said, well, the soil type on that field in that area is just going to do that every single year. So we had straw bales stacked up out in that corner. We would run it a couple times, get stuck out there. go with our straw bales, work it back and forth a few times and get that sprinkler out of there and move on with life. But the trouble is, I really like this picture because it really emphasizes some of the other problems that come along with poor soil structure. But the trouble is, I couldn't go out to my field to take this picture. I had to go over to the neighbor's field to take this picture. And the reason I emphasize that is here we were blaming soil type. But the trouble is, we don't have this problem anymore, but the neighbors still do. So the soil type wasn't the problem, it was how we were managing the soil. So now we have poor soil structure. Now we have a crop that's being over-irrigated. We have a saturated soil with very little pore space. We end up with very poor gas exchange as a result of this. Now we have created the ideal environment for a lot of the diseases to thrive. The diseases in the soil that affect potato crops that are most damaging really don't like oxygen. They thrive in anaerobic conditions. So here we were abusing our soil and creating the environment where those diseases liked to thrive. So that means we're coming in with more fungicides, more fumigants, trying to stay on top of these problems. Also, the plants were wet more often because we were having to over-irrigate the crop because the water and the soil weren't interacting very well together, and we were very inefficient with our water use. And this was having an impact on our weed pressure as well as some other factors. So the weeds that we were dealing with back then, there was two in particular that were really problematic for us. We were dealing with a lot with sunflowers and nightshade. Now there's some really good charts out there. If you go onto Google and start looking up weeds as indicators, if you look up both of those weeds on those charts, they were indicators of some problems that we had in our soil. So usually those two weeds are are something that you would expect to see in a soil with very, very poor structure, very low carbon, and a lot of times weeds are an indicator of a chemical imbalance in your soil as well. You know, the other one that I added in there most recently was beneficial insects. This one, it took me a while to kind of grasp onto, but did you know there's a lot of different beneficial insects that thrive on the surface of the soil where weed seeds are a major component of their diet? So what that means is if they're eating those weed seeds, they're removing them from the seed bank and they can't germinate the next year. But the trouble is if we're coming in with these insecticides and trying to remove all the insects from this crop, now we no longer have those scavenger insects out there to consume those weeds. So there's a lot of different components here that all add to these problems that we're creating ourselves. So now if we have a weed problem out there, of course we're going to have to come in with a herbicide to try controlling these weeds because they were in such a population they were competing with the potato crop. But once again, you have to be very careful when you start using this approach too, because these herbicides, if you use the wrong chemical at the wrong time, you can actually damage the potato crop itself. So one of the very first things we removed from our systems was actually herbicide. We wanted to just try removing one of the sides, and so we relied completely on tillage for weed control. But the thing is, just like Don was talking about, the damages that come along with tillage excessively. Like I mentioned, I'm a potato grower. I'm never going to be no-till. That's not something that's going to happen on my farm, but we've definitely done a lot to reduce tillage on our farm as much as possible. Because every time we do go through and disturb that soil, we are losing carbon, we are physically breaking apart that soil structure, and we are damaging the life in the soil. A lot of these fungi in there are very fragile, and it doesn't take a lot to really destroy that system there. So this was the system that we were using on our farm. It seems like every time we tried solving one problem, we were creating a whole new problem for ourselves. And it was just very defeating. We got very frustrated with the system. So we wanted to take a completely different approach. But what's really nice about soils is it doesn't matter how bad we screw them up or how bad we hurt them, there's always a chance to rebuild that soil. We can always wipe the slate clean and start everything over. But we definitely have to take a completely different approach when we start doing this. So before we talk about anything else, because I'm going to go back in here and start showing you how our system is rebuilding this system and we're creating a positive system full of life. But we need to emphasize one thing, and that's carbon. And I won't spend as much time on this as I normally do because Don, he really pounded that one in. But just for a real quick review, why is carbon so important? You and I need carbon to live. Every living thing needs carbon to live, and we have all the carbon we ever needed in the atmosphere around us. But the trouble is, the carbon that's in the atmosphere does me no good. The only living thing that can really take the carbon from the atmosphere and put it in a useful form is a living plant. So that all happens through the process of photosynthesis, right? We use sunshine for energy, we have CO2 coming in, and it requires water, and at the end of the day, it's basically making glucose. And it's giving off oxygen. We talk about all the time about how plants give off oxygen. It's a result of this chemical reaction there. So now we have this glucose molecule in that plant. And the plant needs that itself for energy, but in order for it to utilize that energy, there's another chemical reaction that takes place, respiration. So now when a plant respires, it actually brings oxygen back in and ends up giving CO2 back off to the atmosphere. That's how that energy is burnt up, is utilized, is through respiration. Now a lot of the emphasis is all about getting the carbon into the soil, right? So early on, we thought all of the value, all of the carbon returned to the soil, the value was in that residue being returned to the soil. Now that is part of it. That residue is very important, but even more important is the root exudates. And that's something we really emphasize on our farm now, is getting that carbon into the soil through the root exudates. And the reason the plant gives up so much of its carbon through the form of the root exudates is to feed the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. It's not like the plant is being foolish or inefficient, because it needs that carbon itself to grow, but these plants can give up 40 to 60% of the carbon they worked so hard to make down into the soil because they want to feed the life in the soil because it's going to get something else in return. So since you guys are already looking up that other paper, when you're on amazingcarbon.com, this is the second paper on that same website I would suggest you read. It's called The Liquid Carbon Pathway. And it's by Christine Jones once again, but she does a tremendous job of really emphasizing the value of root exudates versus residue. And it's really the root exudates, that's the real stable carbon being added to our soil, and that's where a lot of the benefits coming from, more so than from the residue. So I'd really encourage you to read that one as well. So now, once that bacteria and the fungi in the soil get access to this carbon, either through the residue or the root exudates, they go through the exact same process as the plant did in order to utilize those sugars. It has to bring oxygen in, and it goes through respiration in order to break down that glucose molecule, and that's how it actually generates energy. So as a result, the bacteria and fungi are giving the CO2 back off to the atmosphere. It's just like Don was talking about, you know, the chamber out there measuring respiration rates of the soil. That's what that's telling us. It's telling us at what rate is the respiration taking place in the soil. So if you don't have carbon going into the soil, respiration can't take place. But the other thing we need to keep in mind too is what role soil structure plays in all of this, right? So if we have a really tight soil structure, that means oxygen can't get down into the soil to begin with. If we don't have oxygen going into the soil, respiration doesn't take place. But also once respiration takes place and we're giving off CO2, we need that CO2 to leave the soil in order to not create that toxic environment. So this is where opening up that soil structure is so important. You know, and too often I think with soil structure, we put all the emphasis on water. Soil structure is really important for water infiltration rate, but also gas exchange I think we need to put even more emphasis on as far as that good soil structure. So now there's a lot of other life in the soil that relies on this pathway. The protozoa don't get their carbon directly from the plant, but they're feeding on the bacteria and the fungi that were fed from the plant. The same with the earthworms. But no matter what the process is, all living things respire in the same way in order to utilize that glucose molecule. Whether, even if it's the cow that's grazing the cover crop, or if it's us consuming some crop coming off that field, or even indirectly if we're consuming the cow that was feeding off the cover crop, respiration is identical. It always happens in the same way, but it all starts off because of photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, we have nothing to respire. So when I incorporate my cover crops, I add a lot of other fertility components. I'm using compost, and in the compost I mix in some fish and some soybean meal. But the thing to keep in mind with all this is without photosynthesis, none of these three would exist either. Without photosynthesis, compost would not exist because you would not have that carbon source for digesting it. The manure from the cattle for going into the compost would not exist if they didn't have something to eat. The same with the fish and with the soybean. Without photosynthesis and respiration, none of this would happen. So that's why it's such a big emphasis on our farm now. So a lot of people hear about how I'm talking, and most people, even my neighbors, all assume I'm certified organic, right? The way I'm talking about you, I can see why you would make that assumption. I do want to emphasize one thing before I go any further, is we are not certified organic. So a lot of people ask, well, if you're not organic and you're not conventional, what in the world are you? That's why I've been using the term biotic farming. That's what I feel kind of best explains how we're trying to farm now. So it's an agroecological approach that emphasizes carbon cycling with available resources to support a healthy living farm system. And I like having farm system in there because we do talk a lot about soil health, and that's just the beginning, but this all has an impact on our health as well. And so we need to really look at all living things and how we all work together and how this system supports itself. And also available resources, I think, is very important too, because we can sit here and theorize on the best things to do for our soil, but also it has to be able to fit into our economic schedule as well too, because if we spend too much money one year farming in order to improve the health of soil, we can't do it the next year. So really, available resources is really a limiting factor that we always have to keep in mind. Okay, so now we're going to take the system and we're going to rebuild the system. We're going to quit trying to kill off our problems and we're going to come in with life to rebuild the system like we are now. And it all starts with what I'm calling biotic inputs, right? So here's a list of all the biotic inputs that we're utilizing on our farm, whether it be cover crops, companion crops, livestock, nectar hubs, compost, fish, soybean, biologicals. These all have a lot of things in common. They're doing one of two things into this system. So they are either adding carbon to the system or they're introducing some life into the soil. So you take like compost. It's got a food source in there to feed the life in the soil that's already present, but it's also introducing a lot of new species in there that we may have depleted as a result of our farming practices. So it's all about carbon and life. This is where it all starts. So once we have life in the soil, we have a food source to sustain that life, now we have the bacteria and the fungi actually building soil aggregates for us. And not only are these building these aggregates, but these aggregates are very stable. So when we come through and harvest a potato crop, we do have some soil disturbance there, but if you have good soil aggregate stability there, it doesn't reset you to zero each time. You're able to build this and you're able to build up your soil structure over the years, even with that disturbance in there. We also have a lot of carbon added into that soil structure and the carbon to feed that life. So now that we have good soil structure, this has a huge impact on our water. So when we have good soil structure, that means we have a higher water infiltration rate. So that means when I irrigate my crop, I'm actually able to run the sprinkler a little bit faster because the water is going in where it belongs. It's not running off the top of the hills or out of the field. So I've improved my efficiency with the water drastically there. But also with the carbon, I'm also improving the water holding capacity. So once I get the water into the soil, I'm not losing it as easily to evapotranspiration. I'm holding on to that water and it's staying put. So that's had a huge impact on how much water we're using in total. So now, back in 2006 was the first year that we put meters on our sprinklers. So I have exact numbers off of how much irrigation I'm using every year in our potato crop. But the major thing that happened back in 2006 is this is when we actually got away from growing a potato barley rotation. When we were growing a potato barley rotation, we had enough water in the aquifer. We had enough water for both of those cash crops. Like I said, through mismanagement of the aquifer and some drought conditions, we depleted that aquifer to the point where we no longer had enough water to grow both of these crops. So the first thing we did is we got away from barley, which was using about 22 inches of water for irrigation to grow each year, and we went to a cover crop. So as you look at this chart here, the line on the bottom is how much water I've used every year since then to grow my cover crop. I have to manage my cover crop a little bit differently because of the limitation of the water. So I'm growing it in a pretty short window because I want to get the growth out there, address some issues, but I don't have the luxury using water to really extend that cover crop too much further. But what was really nice is we had that direct impact that first year of water conservation by growing the cover crop as opposed to the barley, but it was amazing to us how much less water we had to use on our potato crop the following year. And it was a result of adding the carbon to the soil and improving our soil structure. So now you can see on most years I'm using somewhere between 12 and 14 inches of irrigation to grow a potato crop. I do have that one year in 2011 where we just had a really windy season and I used a little bit more. But I would say most guys in our area are using between 18 and 20 inches to grow the same potato crop as we are. But we have double the organic matter as most of the neighbors and and good soil structure. And I just want to emphasize, the potato crop I'm growing doesn't require less water. It still has the same water requirements, but I've just become so much more efficient with how I'm applying the water. And we've seen huge improvements with our water use efficiency. And so this picture here, you remember that picture I showed you with the center pivot sinking down and making these 18-inch ruts. One of the first things we saw when we started bringing these cover crops, getting away from the chemicals and the synthetic fertilizers, is our soil, the physical structure completely changed. So this was taken right out in the field where we used to make those deep ruts. And now at the end of our growing season now, we're still climbing over these potato rows. When we first started off emphasizing carbon and soil structure on our farm, those ruts went from those really deep ruts, and each year they came up and they were a little less, even to the point where we're climbing over the rows at the end of the season now. So think about that. Now this soil has strength in it. It has the ability to support the weight of this center pivot. The soil particles aren't moving around, they're able to stay put. But think of what impact that has on water infiltration and gas exchange when that soil structure is able to keep those pore spaces open. And what's so nice about soil structure is even under saturated conditions, if you have good soil structure, you still have good gas exchange. Whereas if you have poor soil structure and tight pores, you irrigate that crop, you also shut off the gas exchange that's taking place in there as well. So this was a huge improvement in just the smell of the soil. A lot of these things started changing very rapidly once we started changing our practices. So now we're more efficient with our water. That means we don't have these waterlogged soils. We have good gas exchange. We saw a huge reduction in the pathogens that we were seeing on the tubers themselves. No longer were requiring to use fungicides or soil fumigants. Now we were starting to control our problems with life instead of going in and constantly trying to kill off our problems. Foliar disease, early blight is another thing that we just no longer feel we have a need for fungicides anymore. We're letting the life on the plant now control these problems for us. And there's some of the different biological inputs we're using as well can have a huge impact on the foliar and the soil-borne pathogens. There's a lot of different bacteria and fungi that do a tremendous job of competing with the diseases out there as long as we create the proper environment for them to do their job. So that's all we're trying to do now, really maximize how the life in the soil is functioning and allowing them to do their job. Fertility, we've seen a very similar trend as we did with the water conservation. Like I said, with the fertility, it's not like the potatoes we grow now suddenly have less of a need for fertility. But now that we've gotten away from synthetic fertilizers, we've become so much more efficient. When you're using synthetic fertilizers, there's a couple problems that come along with not only the salts and these other things we talked about, but it's just very inefficient. You end up adding a lot more fertility to the soil than the plant actually needs to grow. And the reasons for that is it's in a water-soluble form, so a lot of it gets leached past the root zone of the potatoes. Some of it's very volatile, so we lose a lot of it in all these other forms. And it's a very leaky system. It's not very efficient. Now all of our fertility that we're using now is carbon-based. And why that's so important is we require the life in the soil to make that fertility available to the plant, but the plant actually feeds the components in the soil that it needs to release the different fertility. So now you have the plant and the soil and the life in the soil all working together to affect the availability of that life in the soil. And also, if we put more fertility out there this year than the crop needs, we don't lose it. We're not volatilizing, we're not leaching, we hold on to it. So through the years, we've been able to bank some of this nutrient, and we've been able to greatly reduce how much fertility we need to put out there year after year. When we first started off getting away from the synthetic fertilizers, we were using compost. We were using 3 tons per acre every single year. Once we got away from the barley, we were able to cut that down to 3 ton every other year. And we were still pulling soil samples, making sure we were staying in a zone that we wanted to be as far as nutrient in the soil. We weren't depleting the soil, but we were just changing the efficiency. Once we got past that, the 3 ton per acre was actually too much. We reduced it down to 2 ton. Then we even reduced it to 1 ton per acre every other year. we finally decided that that 1 ton just wasn't quite enough, so we've bumped it up to 1.5 tons now. So I use 1.5 tons of compost every other year. I mix in a little bit of that soybean and some of the fish, and that's all the more I need to grow this potato crop. Now, I'm not going to say that we've come in and been able to grow more potatoes. At no point have we really seen a yield increase. If it has, it's been very slight, but our goal was always just to maintain the yield, but what we wanted to do was really improve the economics of it a lot differently. So we were growing the same amount of potatoes, but we were growing them for a fraction of the input cost. So we were able to increase our profit margin without necessarily generating more income. So economically, it has become very positive for us just by increasing the efficiency of the fertility. And so like I said, this had a huge impact on the potatoes. The parasitic nematodes was another issue that we were starting to see back when we were using all these chemicals, had the potato barley rotation. We were seeing an elevation in these parasitic nematodes. First thing we did is when we got away from the barley, we brought in some cover crops, and the first thing we wanted to address, well, there was two things. We wanted to conserve water with the cover crops, but we also thought if we're going to commit a full off season to growing these cover crops, let's address an issue we have. So we were planting cover crops that were doing a good job of addressing the parasitic nematode problem for us. So here we were, we had parasitic nematodes, something we were worried about, but at no time did we go in and try to kill these parasitic nematodes. Instead, what we did is we brought more life into the system, and the life in the soil, these different cover crops, is what eventually ended up controlling these parasitic nematode problems for us. So we still pull soil samples every year. It's not like we're pretending like these parasitic nematodes don't exist. We are monitoring them, and we've seen a drastic decline in them to the point where they're no longer causing an economic problem for us. Now, I'm not ever going to claim that we eradicated them, and that should never be your goal with any living thing. We never eradicated those parasitic nematodes, but we reduced the population to where they were no longer causing problems for us. All right, so what if I told you guys I no longer have weeds on my farm? I hear a couple of you laughing. You'd call me a liar, right? Well, I'm not going to claim we no longer have weeds in our farm. But something has changed with the weeds. The weed species on our farm has drastically changed. We no longer see the sunflowers or the nightshade in our potato fields anymore. Remember, both of those were indicators of a lot of problems that are in your soil. The weeds that we see now, the biggest one we deal with is red root pigweed. Now go back into those same charts and look up red root pigweed of what it's an indicator of. Usually pigweed thrives in soils with good drainage, high carbon, and high fertility. So the weeds that we're dealing with now are indicators of a lot of things that we're doing right. So it's something we still have to manage are these weeds, but the species have definitely changed. And one thing that's nice by bringing the cover crops into our rotation is it's actually allowed us an opportunity to address this weed pressure when we're not growing the cash crop out there. So this is one of the multi-species cover crops we've been growing, and how we manage the crop has changed greatly through the years. So the first year I grew that cover crop, we planted it all, had some pigweed pressure come along with it. We were a little late in terminating that crop. A lot of that pigweed went to seed, created more of a problem the next year. So now we've changed how we're managing this crop, and we're actually a lot more aggressive with mowing this crop. So that's what's really nice about the pigweed. It sends up this narrow shoot, all the seed are at the top there. Right after it's done flowering, we come in with our chopper really high and just take all the tops off that pigweed. But it's nice because the cover crop, it can handle that mowing process, and it'll continue to thrive underneath. The grasses and the brassicas do great after you mow them one time, but it's done such a great job of controlling that weed pressure in the off season, so the next year we don't see near as much of the pigweed pressure in the potato crop. And then here's the last one. We still grow certified seed, so we still view aphid as a threat, but we no longer use insecticide. Now we're taking a completely different approach, and we're actually trying to create a beneficial habitat for the predatory insects and letting them control the problem for us. So now we're utilizing a lot of different flowering plants, and I'll go into a little more detail on this, but we're really trying to feed the predatory insects because they need a food source as well, And if you have a high population of beneficial insects, it minimizes the opportunities for the pest insects to come in and dominate your cropping system. You also notice I've got life on the plant there having an impact on them. There's actually a lot of different beneficial fungi that live on potato plants that can actually kill aphid for us. But the trouble is, when we were using fungicides, we were eliminating that defense mechanism from our system. So by removing the fungicides, now we're letting that component work for us as well. So, and you mentioned this ratio earlier on too, is 1,700 to 1. For every one pest insect in a healthy ecosystem, there's 1,700 beneficial insects. But that's only in a system where we put the emphasis on those 1,700 species. And I don't know how this next slide will look, but 1,700 is a pretty big number to me, so I like to create these visuals. So just for an idea, I don't know if this shows real well, but that's basically 1,700 different species on there, beneficials. And the thing is, if we have this many beneficial species thriving in an ecosystem, what chance does any one species of pest have of coming in and dominating this many different species? So the trouble is, we go to the coffee shop and talk to all of the neighbors, right? What do we always talk about is that one pest. Let's quit talking about that one pest and start talking about these 1,700 beneficials, and then we won't have to have those conversations about the pests anymore. So now this is the system we're using now. It's all based on carbon and life, and it supports itself. It develops a very resilient system. I don't like relying on any one input to solve any of my problems. The more different things I can bring in at the same time to solve the same problems, the stronger this system becomes. And if you have this system, like I said, we were talking about soil health, all these great things start happening. But if you have a healthy soil and it's growing a healthy potato plant, there's a lot of different things that plant can do to defend itself against pests and disease and parasitic nematodes as well. Here's just a really good example. This is a good little TED talk I like listening to, but it's by Jack Schultz out of Missouri. But he talks a lot about how plants and insects communicate. And I thought this was pretty interesting because in my mind, when I thought about aphid coming into a potato field, in predatory insects, I assumed the predatory insects were able to find the aphid out in the potato field, right? But it turns out if you have a potato field out, a healthy potato plant growing out there, and if it's fed on by that aphid, it actually releases a scent that attracts the predatory insects to that plant. So once you get out of the way and let all these living things start functioning with each other, they start helping each other out. And I just thought this was a really neat little video if you guys are looking for something to watch later on. Okay, so in that system I just got talking about, one thing I don't think it really emphasizes near enough is plant diversity. And I know that you guys this morning have already touched on this a little bit, but plant diversity right now I think is one of the most beneficial things that I've got going on my farm. The first year that we grew a cover crop, it was a monoculture. We were doing it because we were trying to address nematodes and drought conditions. But I was very fortunate and had Jay Fuhrer come out to my farm, and he was looking at that monoculture, and he said, that's great what you're doing. I'm not surprised you're seeing benefits. But he said, have you ever thought about bringing diversity into these cover crops? He talked to me into that next year planting a 7-species mix out in our cover crop, and it's probably one of the best things we've ever done. The potato crop following this cover crop, it was probably the biggest leap forward we ever took in one season, was following this diversity. And I think we need to change some mindsets when it comes to these diverse cover crops. Because the reason I was afraid to try this crop at first is because I was always taught that diversity created competition. But what we need to do is start recognizing that diversity creates collaborations when the plants are there to complement each other. Because these plants growing together did so much better than I'd ever seen any of those plants perform in a monoculture. It's really bringing these plants together and letting them perform together is when we get the most benefit. So diversity is really easy to see on top, right? Broadleafs and grasses, that's a pretty easy one to focus on, and that's where all my focus was on early on. But what we need to do is forget about the tops and really looking at the diversity in the root systems. That's where the true value is. When you have fibrous roots and tap roots working together, you have some fixing nitrogen, some mobilizing phosphorus, all these different things interacting together, and they're all releasing exudates into the soil. But each plant species is releasing different exudates in the soil to feed different biology in the soil. So those root systems is where so much of the value is. So I started off with a 7-species mix. I was really pleased with that, so I've continued to grow on this mix. This is the mix that I'm currently using on my operation. And the thing, we had to kind of learn a little bit, there's kind of some rules that come along with bringing in diversity into these crops. And I don't bring in diversity just for the sake of diversity. All of these are serving certain purposes and they have a role to play, but they actually complement each other and allow each other to perform those tasks much better. So when I break down my cover crop mixes, I always like to make sure these 4 categories are covered. So this is how that mix breaks down to those 4. You see I've got each one covered multiple times. And we always put an emphasis on the legumes. We always want a mixture of broadleafs and grasses in cool season and warm season because they're all doing different things in the soil. Now, as much as I like that mix there's always a couple things I really like in my mixes, in my soil and in my environment. And as you go into different areas, your guys' list might look a little different. But I just want to touch on a few of these real quick. I really like having buckwheat in my cover crops. They do a couple of things for me. They flower. They flower early and they flower for a long time. And they do a great job of feeding beneficial insects. They also do a good job of mobilizing phosphorus in the soil. In our soil types, we have a lot of phosphorus in our soil, but we also have a lot of calcium. And what do those do when they're together? They bind to each other, and the plant can't access either one. Buckwheat releases an acid from its root, breaks up that bond, does a great job of bringing that phosphorus up, and then when that plant is terminated and breaks down, now that phosphorus is in a different form, and now I have more phosphorus available to my potato crop the next year. I've seen direct results of this right on my soil samples, and we can see that happening, and it's really valuable in my rotation. I like the radishes and the turnips because the deep tillage from the tap roots. We've had some soil pits out on our farm. We've gone 10 feet deep and still can't find the end of those roots. That's what's so nice about that is they're known as nitrogen scavengers. They have a root system that goes much deeper than the root zone of my potato crop. So if I have nutrients that have been leached past the root zone of my potato crop, I can come in with a cover crop the next year. I go down and find those nutrients, bring them back up in those tap roots. When they get terminated, now I have all that nutrient available for the potato crop the next year. They're also very valuable in these mixes because they do a great job of suppressing weeds. They put out a big broad leaf very early, and they are pretty competitive with the weeds. The lentils and peas are great because they can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and add it to the soil. So instead of going to town and purchasing fertilizer from the chemical guys, I put the proper plants out there to add nutrient to my soil for me during this off season. And the lentils and peas do such a better job of fixing nitrogen when they're out there with these radishes and turnips, because the thing with legumes is when they produce nitrogen, it actually, the thing that'll shut down that bacteria in those nodules is nitrogen. So if they start producing too much, they actually start to shut down. But if you have other plants out there that love that nitrogen, they pull it away from those nodules, and actually you end up making more nitrogen than you would in a monoculture of those legumes. And then the millets we really like having out there. They're a great non-host for nematodes and just good at subsoil conditioning. But the other thing that's really nice about this is early on I was taught the value of a long cropping rotation. And when you look at this, it makes a lot of sense. Well, if I want all of these things to happen, that means I need to have a 5 or 6 year rotation. So this year I get this to happen, the next year I get this to happen. But when you come in with these diverse mixes, you can accomplish all of these things every single year that you put that out there. And that's why I saw such a leap forward in our soil health following these multi-species green manures, because we saw so many things happening all at once, and we got that synergistic effect, and we saw so much positive happening in our soil. Now, the latest thing we started bringing in, the guy this morning, he was talking about this, right? Livestock. How important is livestock in our operation? This is the last thing I started bringing into my rotation. I had a lot of diversity in the plants. I had a lot of positive things going on. But what was the thing that was missing? It was the impact of the animals out there. It's something my grandpa had on the farm when he started the farm. He had sheep out there. We're the ones that screwed up and took the animals off the landscape. So now we're bringing them back in, and we're using the cows to now terminate that cover crop for us. So now we make one less pass with the mower. We're not burning off diesel, and we're letting the cows go out there and take care of some of our problems for us. Now, as a result of bringing cattle out there, I did have to shift my cover crop mix around a little bit. But that's what's so nice about these cover crop mixes, is when I use a green cover seed. I saw they were a sponsor of today's event. When I call those guys up, it's great because the first thing they ask you is, what are you trying to manage for? So one thing I had to change, because the mix I was using before I had the cattle out there, we had sorghum sudan as part of the mix. We were a little worried about that because if we got a frost, you deal with prussic acid. The rancher didn't want to deal with that. So we got away from those, brought in the millets. We also brought in some different things like a brown mid-rib corn, some grazing collards. So I was still satisfying the needs of what I was trying to get out of the cover crop, but we were also creating a nice mix out there for the cattle so that both guys were winning. So we were satisfying a lot of needs. And the other thing that's nice about this cover crop calculator, you see on top there, it's got different scores for different things. And grazing and diversity score a 10 out of 10 on this mix. So we know this mix is accomplishing all the goals of what we need to. So the manure is great out there. And even, the difference of grazing versus mowing a crop has a different impact on the soil health. But one thing I do want to emphasize, I think back home anyways, there's a huge misconception about having cattle out on these cover crops. Because first thing everybody thinks about is all the manure. They say, well, that's great that you're adding all this fertility to your soils. But am I really? Because there's nothing in that manure that didn't come from the cow. There's nothing in that cow that didn't come from the plant. There's nothing in the plant that didn't come from the soil. So I'm not really adding fertility to the soil by doing this, but I am recirculating it. I'm creating the poop loop, as they say. And so I'm changing the availability of the nutrients out there, but it's also stimulating a lot of biological activity by having it out there. So it still has a lot of value out there. So that's why I refer to that as a soil health improvement tool. Okay, so I do till my soil. Don was talking a lot about the value of no-till and the damaging effects. I get that. I've tried changing how we manage the residue out there and trying to leave more out there. The trouble is I did reach a point to where I was leaving too much, and when I would go try to plant potatoes out there, it created an absolute nightmare. So for me, I terminate the crop with this piece of tillage equipment here. We make one pass. I'm making one pass every other year as far as tillage. But for me, too much residue out there does become trash when I'm in a potato rotation. So I do manage my crop a little bit. I don't go through with a plow. It's about 12 inches deep, and it's really just enough to kind of terminate the root system. And I want some good soil-plant contact so it will break down in time for the potatoes the next year. But at the same time, I'm working in that manure. Before we make this pass, I go out and spread my compost with the fish and the soybean out there. So right when we incorporate that, there's a lot of biological activity going on, and it's really nice time for that soil. So I'll go ahead and make my potato rows following this. I've got my fertility set up for the next season, and there's just so much biological activity going on out there that I'm setting myself up for a successful potato crop the next season. So here I was with a lot of diversity in my rotation crop. 16 species on the rotation crop, but I still had a monoculture potato crop. And this started to really bother me. I was starting to see the value of this diversity, and I wanted to bring diversity into the potato crop. Well, I got real lucky one day because we used to grow field peas. And once in a while, I'll run across a patch out in the potatoes where some peas are volunteering. Came across that patch one day, and I went to pull them as if they were a weed, and I thought, well, no, they're not doing any harm. Well, if those peas weren't doing any harm, I started thinking, well, maybe this is something I can kind of utilize to my benefit. So the next year when we planted potatoes out there, me and my brother hopped on our 4-row planter. We each had a bucket of peas, and we just planted peas on 2 rounds. One on one field, one on the other. We just wanted to see if I was able to establish peas in my potato crop. Well, think about it. Now it would be the opportunity to add a diverse root system. It's a legume, so maybe I can add some nitrogen during the cash crop, and they flower too, so another opportunity to feed some beneficial insects. But what was really funny is when I first tried this, everybody kept telling me it was going to fail. They kept telling me, why would I want to create competition in my potato crop? And I thought that was really interesting. So that's why we just did a couple of patches. We wanted to try it out. When we went to harvest this crop, I had 8 rows with the peas. So we harvested those 8 rows by themselves, put those potatoes on a truck. We harvested 8 rows on this side and 8 rows on this side. And guess where we had the largest yield? It's where we had those peas. So explain to me, if I created competition out there, how did I just improve my yield? We need to get past this mindset of that we're creating competition with diversity. If you have complementary plants together, you create a collaboration. So the first time I did this, I didn't really go into it with the intentions of increasing yield. I didn't know if the nitrogen that was being fixed right then and there was going to benefit that potato crop or not, or if it's something I'd get a benefit from down the road. So I've talked to enough people about this now, and I've gotten a lot of support to indicate that as long as there's good mycorrhizal populations in the soil, it can actually attach the root system from the peas to the root system of the potatoes, and it can actually transport the nutrient directly to the potatoes during the growing season. So that's where I had to make a little mindset shift with my own. Because I always thought of mycorrhiza fungi as attaching to the roots and going out into the soil, right? Well, that's only part of it. I think we're starting to understand more and more now how it's connecting the plants together. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Now, if I was going in with heavy fungicide use and killing off that mycorrhiza, I just cut off that flow of nutrients, and I'm not going to see the same benefits as I would in a living soil. So I was so pleased with what those peas did out there that the next year, well, there we go, we started adding some diversity in there. But the next year, I actually modified my planter. So I put Gandy boxes on front of my potato planter here. So that way I could plant the peas on the entire farm. Because I didn't really want to sit on the back of that planter the whole time planting peas by hand. That would have gotten pretty old pretty fast. So the only thing I had to really figure out this year, well, there was a couple of things, was trying to figure out how to work this into the system to where those plants would thrive, but I can still control weeds. So I had to plant them pretty deep. But also the seeding rate. Nobody was able to hand me a manual on the correct seeding rate for planting peas and potatoes. So I kind of had to learn this one by the seat of my pants. But what was nice about the Gandy box is you just change some gears on there. You can change your seeding rate. In the first year I had peas everywhere, but I had different seeding rates. I went from anywhere from 5 to 40 pounds of peas. After evaluating the different lots, I felt pretty good with about 15 pounds of the pea seed per acre. So that's what I still do. 15 pounds I feel pretty good with. And when you look at the economics of this, that 15 pounds only cost me about $6 per acre to plant that companion crop out there. And I don't know about you guys, but how much nitrogen can you buy for $6 an acre? Not a whole lot. So I think I'm definitely easily able to justify the value of paying for that extra seed out there. So when I plant the peas, they're getting planted at the same depth as my potato seed piece. So you can see there I've got the potato seed piece sprouting. And when I first did this, I was worried about those peas coming up from that depth at all. But the thing is, it's actually, I had the exact opposite problem. These dang peas actually come up too fast. Because when I still use cultivation for controlling weeds in these potatoes, and when I make my first passes, right, when I've got a potato sprout about that big, and a lot of times I've already got peas poking out of the top of that hill. So I made that first pass, I went through and knocked the tops off of all of those peas. And it was the first year I did, and I thought, man, I think I just killed this whole companion crop idea. That might have been a waste. But here's where I had to educate myself a little bit on the growth habit of that seed piece. You have two different ways that seeds can perform, right? You have epigeal and hypogeal germination. If it's epigeal, what it means is it pushes the cotyledons out of the soil. Now, if I had used a seed that had that performance, I would have knocked the tops off, those plants would have been done. But peas are hypogeal, so that means it leaves the seed down in the soil and sends up a shoot. When I knock the top of that pea off, all it does is go down to the next node and starts another plant over for me. And even by taking all the tops of those peas off, I still ended up with a tremendous stand on my companion crop because they were hypogeal, so they were able to recover from that process. So it's something I have to keep in mind, especially as I add even more diversity into this system. Peas were a great introduction to diversity in those potatoes that first year, but I wasn't content with that. So the next one I started adding in was chickling vetch. It's another legume, so it's adding nitrogen to the soil, but it also is a different plant, so it releases different exudates into the soil. And chickling vetch is really known for the high amount of different exudates it sends into the soil, and it does a lot to stimulate a lot of diversity in the soil. And so here you can see I've got potato plant. The picture on the bottom is chickling vetch coming up with my potato plant. And on the top one, I've got peas coming up with my potato plant now. And the plants really complement each other very well. The next one I brought in was Desi chickpea. So that's the one on the bottom there with the chickling vetch growing on top. Now that I had some diversity out there, it was really interesting observing how the different companion plants did with different potato varieties. Because potato varieties, we grow 25 different varieties, but no two plants look alike. Some of them come up really early, put these big bushy plants out. Some of them come up slower and have a smaller plant. By having diversity out there, it's interesting seeing how the different species in my companion crop do better or worse with the different plant types on the potatoes as well. So if I only had one species out there, I might have certain potato varieties that do very well with that one species, and in other varieties they may not do as well. By having diversity out there, I'm kind of letting the system figure itself out, and something's going to thrive out there each time. Because the peas tend to do better with the bigger plants because they climb up that potato plant. The chickpeas tend to be a little more closer to the ground, so they do better with a smaller potato plant, where the peas kind of fail in that area. So diversity plays such a critical role over and over again. And also, here's a picture of some of the nodules I'm making on there. So you know those things have to be fixing some nitrogen. I'm really excited when I dig those up and see those nodules right next to my potato crop. So the last thing I started adding in was buckwheat. This one happened a little bit on accident as well. So early on in our rotational crop, it was a 2-year rotation, we always had buckwheat in our cover crop, and sometimes that buckwheat would go to seed pretty early, so I'd end up actually with some buckwheat volunteering in the potato crop the next year. But everywhere that I had buckwheat coming up out in my potatoes, it was loaded with all these different predatory insects out there. All 3 of these do a tremendous job of consuming aphid for me. So I want that buckwheat out there. So I actually, instead of just relying on the volunteer buckwheat, I've actually started adding it in with my companion mix, and I'm establishing that buckwheat out in the potato crop each year. So now that buckwheat is only a single species out there, and it's doing a great job of attracting beneficial insects. But at the same time, I was going through a different thought process in my greenhouse crop as well. I wanted to get away from insecticide use in my greenhouse crop because aphid can come into that greenhouse crop and devastate a greenhouse crop too. So I would go out and purchase ladybugs and lacewings and release them into that crop. They'd be there for about 48 hours and then they'd be gone. And then the aphid would come in and colonize anyways. So what was I lacking? I didn't have the proper environment for those beneficial insects. So I started planting a diverse flowering crop right into my greenhouse mix. And so here's the list of all the species I was planting in there. I came across this flowering mix and it was called a green lacewing mix. I thought, well, that's ideal. So that's one of the species I want to establish in my greenhouse crop. So I started planting these flowers in my potato crop, and then I was able to purchase the beneficial insects one time, and since they had the food source in there, they actually started reproducing. Not only were they not leaving, but they were increasing their own population. So how do I know this is happening? Because I can release adult ladybugs, but as long as I have this flowering crop established in there, later on I can find egg, pupa, and larvae of those ladybugs. So they are reproducing in that greenhouse, so now those aphid don't have a chance of coming in and colonizing and destroying this crop for me. But without the flowering crop, I would not see this. And I also like diversity in those insects as well, so I don't rely on just the ladybugs, but I release lacewings as well. And I can see the larvae of them crawling all over, and I'll see adults later on as well. So talk about a tremendous defense mechanism set out in the greenhouse. So I really wanted to emphasize that plant diversity out in the field for the exact same reasons, controlling that aphid population. So what I started doing is when I have a full circle of potatoes, so it's 120 acres, I will take 8 rows out of the middle of that field, right where the center pivot lines up, and I will plant a flower mix right in there. So in this picture here, I've already got potatoes planted, but they haven't come up yet. But I want to get a jump on getting these flowering crops out there so I can create that nectar hub. I want to start producing food for these beneficial insects. And so I'll plant them right through the middle. Now here's where it got real interesting. The reason I liked having that strip out there is the buckwheat's going to come along a little bit later on. I'll have flowers throughout the whole crop. I wanted to get a jump on these beneficial insects. Because to me, I thought, well, I need the flowers out there. So let's start planting them now so they can bloom and start feeding the beneficials. But that first year, it really blew my mind because that crop was only about that tall, and I was already seeing beneficial insects out there. So nothing was even close to blooming yet. So what was feeding these beneficial insects? Well, that's when I was introduced to what's called extra floral nectar. Pretty fancy word, but do you know what it means? Basically means these plants produce water droplets that are full of sugar, and those plants immediately start feeding those beneficial insects from a very early stage. And I'm sure you guys have all seen it. You know, like a sunflower, I think, is a great example of it. Have you ever seen those water droplets around the edge of a sunflower leaf? That's exactly what's going on there. They are releasing these water droplets full of sugar because they are feeding the beneficial insects, because they know those insects are going to help defend them against these pests. So now I start off with a flower strip through the middle of the field, a real diverse mix. It starts feeding the beneficials very early on, and then I get the potatoes and the companion crop coming up later on, and then these beneficials can disperse from there, and they have a food source throughout the entire potato crop. And I have just a fabulous population of all these beneficial insects in my potato crop, so now I don't have aphid are no longer a threat to me. And I have proof of this by being able to maintain the cleanliness of our seed lots. We're doing a really good job of keeping our seed certified without the use of insecticides, but it all comes back to planting these diverse flowering crops. Now, the other thing that's really important about the diversity in these plants is that you want diversity in flowers, because you want some that'll bloom early, you'll want some that'll bloom late, but they also have different nutritional values. So you want to have, the insects need access to that diversity, but also you want diversity in the architecture of the plants too. You want some tall plants mixed with short plants to create all this diversity in environments to really emphasize the diversity in the insects. So now the latest thing I started adding into my companion crop, because one year I had faba beans in with my flowering mix, and I started reading up a little bit on them, and faba beans are one of these that do a tremendous job of producing the extra floral nectar. Beneficial insects absolutely love faba beans. They also produce a heck of a lot of nitrogen, so I thought, well, this would be a great one to add into my companion mix in the potatoes. Now, early on, the biggest reason I didn't do it early on was because faba beans are a great big seed. It was hard getting them through the Gandy box. But lately, they've been developing some different species of faba beans with a really small seed to them. Now they fit right in with that mix. And this last year, I had a tremendous crop of faba beans throughout the potato crop, too. So as the neighbors drive by, they look at my fields out there, and they think I'm doing a poor job of managing weeds. But I'm driving by thinking I did a great job of establishing this companion crop. So really shifting the mindset is one of the hardest parts about this approach. So I did mention before that I like the term biotic farming, and there's a couple reasons why. Because I like going back and comparing these two systems, you know, one with life and one with death. But when you use that term biotic, once you define what that means, then you have two different choices. You can either be probiotic or antibiotic. And this plays back to what I was talking about with that healthy living farm system. Not only are we trying to use these practices because we're trying to improve soil health, but we're really trying to emphasize the human health as well. My employees love working on our farm because they don't ever have to worry about being exposed to different chemicals. They know that they are safe out there. When we have inspectors for certified seed come out to our field, they fight over coming out to my field because they don't have to worry about reading the signs and the warnings. They know they're safe out there. And this last year, I actually told them they were more at risk of a bee sting than they were to chemical exposure on my farm. And they really appreciated that. So I just thought it's interesting with antibiotic. Once again, you look that up in the dictionary, and that's how it's defined. Tending to prevent, inhibit, or destroy life. But like I said, here we are. We're farmers. We're trying to create food to sustain life. It's all about bringing life back into the system, and that's where our emphasis is on our farm. Just lots of life out there. Got a lot of beekeepers really interested in what we're doing now on our farm as well. So I talked a lot about creating communities in the soil, creating communities with the plants, but this approach to agriculture has also brought our community back together. Now I'm working with beekeepers and I'm working with ranchers, and it's bringing a lot of farmers together. We're sharing these practices and helping each other out. So I imagine I'm getting pretty close on time. That's all I got for you. A couple of websites there if you're interested just for some other resources, but I'm going to call it good.